This podcast is presented by Skies Magazine. If you're interested in the Canadian aviation industry, Skies is your go-to multimedia resource for the latest news, in-depth features, stunning photography, and insightful video coverage. Whether you're an aviation professional or enthusiast, Skies is dedicated to keeping you informed and bringing your passion for aviation to life. Visit skiesmag.com to learn more and subscribe to stay updated on all things Canadian aviation.
Fuel and ignition switches. On. RPM switches. Set. TD switches. Normal. Doors and hatches. Closed. Light out. Strobe light. On. Restart check is complete. Clear left. Engineers. Start number 2. Starting 2. Wind 310, Pilot Project Podcast. Clear takeoff. Runway 31 left.
All right, we're ready for departure here at the Pilot Project Podcast, the best source for stories and advice from RCAF and mission aviation pilots, brought to you by Skies Magazine. I'm your host, Brian Morrison. With me today for the second of our special two-part Remembrance Day series is a legendary figure in Canadian aviation circles, Major Retired Bob Wade, a former snowbird and Cold War fighter pilot, and the first Western pilot to fly in a MiG-29. Bob, welcome once again to the show, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Brian. My pleasure.
Listeners can check out part 1 to hear about how Bob joined the CAF and his days on the Tudor and Starfighter. Today, we will be talking about Bob's time on the CF-18, his adventure flying a MiG-29, and his transition to civilian flying, and how he still connects with his time in the CAF. So at the end of part 1, we had kind of left it at your time flying CF-104s in Europe, in Germany. You did come back to Cold Lake and start instructing on CF-104s, correct?
That's correct. When I was 5 years in Europe, and my posting after that was onto the Starfighter as an instructor at 417 Squadron in Cold Lake.
And then eventually the CF-104 Starfighters were being retired with the arrival of the CF-18 Hornet, right? And you learned that you'd be instructing on these new jets?
That's correct, yeah. We were winding up the program as the F-18 came in, and first 2 airplanes arrived in October of 1982. And we were getting 2 airplanes a month after that. So the initial stand-up was just giving the guys an opportunity to learn how to fly the airplane. And I was still instructing on the last course of 104 pilots in Cold Lake going overseas. And they told me I'd be moved over to instruct on the CF-18 once the squadron stands up. And so that we did that at the end of the 104 program. We actually flew 12 airplanes, 12 104s to Europe through Greenland, Iceland, over to Scotland, then down to Baden. So that was quite an adventure to finish up a career on that Starfighter. And then when I got back from that mission, I went over to 410 Squadron in Cold Lake to instruct on that airplane. Now, initially, we didn't have enough airplanes to take on a student course. So that first year, we just developed tactics to learn how to fight the airplane. The United States Navy was receiving them at the same time. So nobody had any tactical experience as to how to employ that fighter. And we developed a syllabus. I ran the ground attack syllabus. Other boys developed the air defense syllabus. And we were various backgrounds that were posted into 410 Squadron. So some of the guys were off Voodoos, F5s, and as a Starfighter. And we didn't have weapons that employed the smart technology. So we're actually dropping bombs the same way we did with the 104. The difference was the CF-18 had a CCIP, Continuous Computing Impact Point, displayed in the heads-up display. So that rather than having to have the pilot hit an exact dive angle with an exact airspeed and exact release point on the ground at an offset for wind when you release the weapon, that airplane did it all for you. So that that considerably helped the students learn to do that ground attack role. And once we'd gone through that, we wrote the syllabus for the students. We got students a year later, and we ran the first course. Now, those courses were comprised of a whole squadron. So every 9 months, we're standing up a new squadron. We're taking 28 pilots through on a course at a time. It was a busy, busy time to be flying the F-18. And we were quite excited to have that jet. I was a little disappointed with its lack of power after coming off a Starfighter, so that it didn't want to go high speed, low altitude because of the large wing. It was very rough down low altitude, whereas the Starfighter was like a Cadillac down there. It was so smooth at high speed and low level. So that there were some differences, but in reality, it did a better job than the Starfighter did, because you could carry more weapons. We could carry 10 Mark 82 500-pound bombs. And in those days, all our Mark 82s were high drag because we're releasing them from 200 feet above the target. We didn't want that bomb detonating right underneath us. So when the bomb came off the airplane, fins deployed on the back of the bomb to retard it so that it detonated well behind your aircraft. And nowadays, of course, they don't have to do that. Their smart weapons are laser guided or GPS guided, and so that you can release those weapons from high altitude and get great accuracy. But back in the early days, we were just employing it like we did with the Starfighter and F-5. In the air defense role, it was a huge jump in technology from the earlier CF-101 Voodoo. And so that those boys did a remarkable job at setting up that program to teach students how to do air intercepts, air defense. And we were gunfighters. We didn't figure that we had enough missiles or the missiles were good enough to avoid us having to gunfight. And so that in those days, the Warsaw Pact outnumbered 9-1 in the air. So that we didn't have enough weapons to take them all out unless we used our gun. And that F-18 was about the best gunfighter in the sky because it had no angle of attack limit. So that the F-15s, F-16s that came online before the F-18 were limited to 25 degrees angle of attack. So they couldn't maneuver at really low speeds like an F-18 could. And so that a good gunfight was 2 F-16s against one of us in an F-18, because we had so much more turn capability and ability to operate at high angles of attack. We could do intercepts, and the boys set it up so they were doing stern conversions the same as what they did in the Voodoo, where you would offset from the target and then at a certain point turn to roll out in the stern of that target. And that came out to be a problem, because if that radar, it's a pulse Doppler radar, if you got into the beam on your target and it didn't sense movement, well, then it went into prediction mode. And we lost one of the students on that first course because he started chasing this prediction of where the target was, got into a steep dive and hit the ground.
Oh,
So we had to revise the syllabus from that to make it a visual environment where they're doing it. Students could no longer do that in cloud. And so that was a lesson well learned. Unfortunately, we lost a young fella while he went through that transition.
how did it feel personally for you to transition from the Starfighter to the Hornet after putting in so much time on Starfighters?
I was excited to fly the F-18 because it was new technology. Everything's ran by a computer. We had no computers on the Starfighter. You could take your helmet off in flight, and it was quiet inside the cockpit. Whereas the F-18, you take your helmet off, it's noisy because of all the computers running all the systems, type of thing. And it would do so much more. I could track 12 targets at one time, and whereas the Voodoo boys couldn't do that with their airplane. So it was a huge jump in technology. I love that about the airplane, but it didn't go fast like a Starfighter. I've had it up to 1.65, but it took forever to get there, burned a lot of fuel to get there. But in reality, you didn't have to go Mach 1.7, in that airplane, because you had missiles that did 4 times the speed of sound. And I didn't have to chase anybody down. Those missiles would do that job for me. And so that was just awesome to see that happen.
You mentioned that you had to try to learn to use the Hornet in combat before the students arrived so that they could learn from you. How did this process go? And do you think that it's a similar process to what many instructors will have to do in the coming years as all these new fleets come online?
They'll go through the same process with the F-35 when it arrives, and because it's different technology again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know much about the F-35 because I don't have a security clearance. But one of the students on my first course at 410 Squadron was Billy Flynn. Billy became the chief test pilot on that F-35 program. So talking to Billy, it's a pretty impressive airplane, but it does so much more than what the F-18 would do. And so that I don't understand what it does. And Billy, of course, couldn't tell me. It's all classified. And so that I take his word for it that it's the best fighter in the sky today. So those boys are going to have to go through that same process to learn how to fight that airplane, how to employ it tactically.
Yeah, I do see. I follow Billy Flynn on Facebook, and actually, one day I'd love to have him on the show. But he's obviously very, very positive about the F-35, that it is the jet for the job, and that Canada's doing the right thing and sticking with it.
Yeah. And, Billy's a company pilot, so naturally he's going to promote the airplane.
Yeah.
But, I look at the last, 15 countries that have replaced their fighter aircraft have all bought the F-35. They can't all be wrong. And the other factor is that, especially in NORAD, they don't want you there with an F-18 if they're flying F-35s, because you're just highlighting their formations. You can't communicate and work with the F-35 because you don't have that technology.
Yeah, that's right. Interoperability becomes the paramount concern.
Huge, yeah. And most of NATO and NORAD will be flying the F-35.
That's right. So after a little while, you were selected as the CF-18 demo pilot. That was in 1986. What was the public opinion like on the Hornet at that time?
We were getting a lot of bad press because we'd paid a lot of money, and I think it was $35 million per aircraft that we bought, and we bought 138 of them. And the media took the attitude that, well, you're buying an airplane built for the United States Navy to fly off aircraft carriers, and you're trying to make it apply to our requirements here in North America. And why would you do that? And I did an interview when I was doing air shows. I did an air show in Toronto, and I did a CBC interview. And that boy, he just threw question after question. Why would we buy an airplane like that? And we'd had 3 accidents, fatal accidents. Was it the airplane's fault? And this type of thing, when it wasn't. Those were all pilot error accidents.
They usually are.
Yeah. And they were very negative on that airplane. But I was able to explain to them that the government of Canada gives the Air Force a mandate that they are to achieve in defense of North America and their commitments worldwide. And the F-18 was the best jet available to meet those requirements. And as it turned out, we needed that carrier capability because I ran a forward operating location out of Inuvik, which had a 5,900-foot runway. And it's icy up there in the wintertime. And the only way we could operate safely was to bring in mobile arrestor gear, which is a cable across the approach end of the runway, with trap on every landing like you do on a carrier. A little bit easier than going on a carrier because the landing pad's not shifting up and down 20 feet or so. But we never had an airplane leave the runway, so it was a good way. And I could get all 6 of my jets down in about 10 minutes. So it was a very fast system that worked for us. If we didn't have an F-18, we couldn't have operated in the Arctic. There was no infrastructure up north at that time. So we were living in hotels downtown, and they flew in all the infrastructure we needed to operate every time we deployed into a Navy. So having a Navy jet was valuable to us.
Yeah. How did you end up being the F-18 air demonstration pilot? You were not the first, right? But one of the first.
Then I had two pilots do that before me in 84 and 85. Then what they decided to do, because these squadrons were so busy, 425 Squadron down in Baggaville, just standing up, and they're trying to get everybody combat ready. And us at 410 Squadron in Cold Lake, there were no other operational squadrons in Cold Lake then. We were busy pumping out 28 students every 9 months. It was a busy time. And so what they decided to do is they'd have one pilot from 425 Squadron Baggaville do all the shows in Western North America or in Eastern North America, and Cold Lake would do all the shows in the Western part of North America. And so that they asked me if I'd do that, and I said, sure. I like doing air shows. And Tristan DeConnick was my partner out of Baggaville that year. And unfortunately, Tristan killed himself on departure out of Summerside on his first show.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was such a tragedy. And again, pilot air, but the F-18, because you fly through a HUD, it gets really easy to get disorientated when you're doing aerobatics, and he got into cloud and pulled it into the ground. So what they decided to do is they'd make me the demo pilot for all of North America that year. And I did 56 shows that year, and my show was very aggressive. Because we were getting all this bad press, I wanted to demonstrate the total capability of that airplane. And because it had such great turn performance, I could keep it on stage for the whole show, 12-minute show. And all my turnarounds were done in the vertical. So you watch guys at shows today, they're doing their turnarounds horizontal to the ground. And so that they'll do their pass on stage, and then they'll have to turn around, and there's typically 40 seconds to a minute before they get back on stage again. I never left center stage, because as soon as I finished that maneuver, I would pull at 6G up to 70 degrees nose up, do 1.5 rolls, top out at an altitude, and then pull it through back out of center stage, to do the next maneuver. And when you're doing air shows, time on stage is what it's all about. Okay. So that the public's not watching you when you're out there turning around for that, for over half the time of the show, you're off stage. And so that the public ate that up. But it was very aggressive. And early in that spring, I did a show down in, where was that? I did a show, Trenton, Ontario was where it was. And the chief of defense staff was there. And he saw my show, and he thought it was too aggressive. It was unsafe. And so he grounded me. And so that the commander of fighter group didn't agree with him. And he wrote me and said, hey, give me your margin of error on every maneuver. And so I did. I sent the message back down to fighter group, and they said, well, go ahead. My next show was in Vanderhoof, BC. He says, go ahead and do that show unless you hear from us. Well, I didn't hear anything, so they changed Terrio's mind. The CDS changed his mind, said, okay, say. Terrio's big deal was it wasn't politic to upstage the F-15 and F-16 so badly. But those boys didn't have they had 25 alpha limits on their jets. They couldn't do what I could do.
And for the listeners, just a quick note on what alpha means. Alpha stands for angle of attack, and without getting too technical, it's a key performance limitation, and it is the angle between the wing and the relative airflow.
I did a takeoff loop. I've never seen a takeoff loop done by any aircraft before. And that was done because I wanted to demonstrate the thrust to weight capability of that airplane. And because I was an instructor in Moose Jaw and I learned how to do this stuff by having exact altitudes, I never had any fear of not being able to make a pullout to miss the ground. So that when I did the work up to the show, I took the airplane from 300 knots, rolled it on its back, and pulled it through at max pull through, and I lost 1,600 feet of altitude on that pull through. So I decided then, okay, the tops of all my looping maneuvers will be 3,200 feet. So I had an extra 1,600 feet to play with. Plus, I made my loops round. They weren't like we did in Moose Jaw, where you pull up and you use the same amount of G all the way through the thing so that it looks more like a big L-shaped type of maneuver rather than a round loop. So I would push that. So I had the exact altitude on every pull-through. I had the exact airspeed on every pull-through. And so those disciplines we learned back in Moose Jaw proved to be very valuable. So they thought, I've heard guys say it's dangerous. There was nothing dangerous about that. I felt very comfortable. And I designed my show so that I would never have to do the level rolls into the sun. Now, because I was flying an F-18, I was normally near the end of the show or closing the show where the sun gets low on the horizon. You never want to be doing level rolls into that sun. So what I did is I designed it for an airborne arrival where I'd do a cloverleaf. I'd run straight at the crowd and then pull up and then do a cloverleaf one direction or another so that I knew my level rolls would be away from the sun. So that's another design capability that kept it safe. And the airplane will roll at 720 degrees a second, but you're only allowed one roll at max max aileron deflection. So that what I would do is roll at 400 degrees per second type of thing. So depending on the length of the show line and the crowd, I would do 5 or 6 level rolls. And I never brought my nose up to initiate the roll. I maintained level flight by pushing it each time I hit the inverted position. So they were actually level rolls. And you don't see that anymore either. So, and it's mostly a lack of experience from the kids nowadays. And then I wanted to show the maximum pitch rate of that airplane. And so that we did a square loop. And the boys that did it 2 years before me, they were doing square loops as well. But each corner is square, and I'd pull it right up to 70 alpha. It had turned lots of vapor onto the wings. It looked impressive. But it showed you the maximum pitch rates of the airplane. And then I wanted to show the slow speed capability of the airplane. So that I did a high-speed 360 first. That aircraft will turn at 32 degrees per second, which I'm sure the F-35 will do as well. But that meant that you can do a 360-degree turn in about 11 seconds, And that was done at corner velocity 325 knots, and that was done at 8G. Okay, so it was pretty impressive. The crowd loved that, to be able to see an airplane sustain 8G through a 360-degree turn and do that in 12 seconds. Again, I haven't seen that done now. The guys demoing now are running 25, 30 seconds to do that 360-degree turn. And then coming out of that, I would want to do a high alpha 360-degree turn. And I knew from my 104 days, you never bring your power back below 90% when you're in that low-level environment. When you need power, you need it fast.
Listeners might be wondering what needing power fast has to do with not retarding your power below 90%. On a jet engine, when you apply power from a low power setting, there's a spool up time before the engine actually provides max power. By keeping the engine at a higher RPM, you avoid this spool up time.
And so that I got back to the 35 degrees angle of attack by pulling G. Okay, so that's how I decreased airspeed, not by reducing power. And what I determined was that from 35 degrees angle of attack, if I lose, I'm doing that at 300 feet above the ground. When I'm doing that, if I lose an engine, I have power available to climb up with one engine. And I practiced that a lot of times where, up at higher altitudes, I'd shut down the engine, I'd turn the engine off, one of the engines off, and then throw the other one into burner. And I'd only lose maybe 50 feet. I never lost more than 50 feet. So I felt very comfortable. If I lose an engine doing that high alpha pass, I can climb out. And fortunately, that never happened to me. So I never had to use it. But it was a design feature that was so adamant, and I see guys bringing back their power now, and, that's a mistake. You don't do that low altitude. And then out of that 35 alpha 360 degree turn, like the burners, and now I'm better than 1-to-1 thrust to weight. I could climb up to 3,500 feet from that 35 degree angle of attack and accelerate climbing up to 70 degrees nose up. So it was pretty impressive to see that. Then I just pull it through and do a vertical roll. So the air show was very effective at demonstrating all the capabilities of that F-18. And when you compared it to other airplanes, it was by far the winner.
So just a super high performance show, but with lots of various safety gates built in to make sure that while it was showing off all the performance the F-18 had, it was still safe.
Very safe. I never had any anxiety. I broke a flap drive when I was in Vanderhoof, so that all my hard pulls were away from the ground, and so that one flap went down, the other flap stayed up. They're maneuvering flaps, and I couldn't control the roll. I couldn't stop it roll with full stick deflection. Okay, and so that I always wanted to make sure, and especially in that last corner of the square loop, I didn't want to break a flap drive because I couldn't have recovered from that. That was the only part that was questionable. So what I would do on that back side of that square loop, I would start the pull early at low G letting so the flaps would go down, and then I'd bury the stick and make it a square corner.
And that's part of the early days of just getting used to how the fly-by-wire magic worked.
Exactly. Yeah, when you put in the lateral stick to roll the airplane, the flight control computers decide which flight controls they're going to use. They could use differential flap, differential aileron to meet your demand for roll. But what they were doing was giving you that roll rate that you're demanding with the least amount of drag.
Mm-hmm.
It was a smart system.
So smart that it was hard to understand. From what I've heard in the early days.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of your Cold War ops and NORAD. You talked about this a little bit, but in 1987, you were posted to the startup of 441 Squadron in Cold Lake as the F-18 took on the NORAD air defense role. You were the squadron ops officer and ran alert operations out of Comox with forward operating locations in Inuvik and Yellowknife. What was life like running alert operations out of Inuvik?
I loved it. We had never operated in the Arctic before. And we had no infrastructure up there to support us. In fact, we didn't even have a hangar. We used the Atmospheric Environmental Services hangar up there, which is a government hangar, and they weren't using it much. So that when I deployed up there, I could get all 6 of my jets into that hangar because it's a Navy bird. The wings folded up. So I had enough room in that hangar to get 6 jets inside. What I didn't have was a mule to tow airplanes around. And they never brought one up on the Herc because the Hercs were loaded with other equipment, and they didn't have the room to put in a mule. So I went downtown and got a guy with a tractor, and he would deploy with us whenever there was a scramble. He'd be there before us, and he could tow airplanes outside with his tractor. So it was a community effort. One day we broke the mobile arrestor gear, and the welder came out from town to do that work and repair the system. He wouldn't take a dime for that. He just wanted to help. The people in Inuvik were outstanding. We stayed in the hotel downtown. We rented cars from local dealers, and it was a huge effort to make that work without any infrastructure, but it worked so well. We had no problems really dealing with the roles that we were assigned.
In March, during the Cold War, the Soviet Bear bombers would practice cruise missile attack profiles against North America. What was the atmosphere like during Soviet bomber training flights, and were tensions high during these flights?
The Soviets were flying their Bear bombers across on cruise missile profiles as a matter of routine, generally in the winter months that come through. And we would get advised by NORAD typically a day before this was about to happen. And we had deployed to Inuvik, and then they would scramble us at the appropriate hour so we could do the intercept. Now, we were going up to 80 north, so we were going a long ways up there. We were 400 or 500 miles away from the nearest airport. And we had tanker aircraft that gave us fuel. But because we were so far away from those support airfields, we had to keep topped up in fuel all the time. We flew with a 3-tank configuration, and you were on that tanker every 10 minutes, to keep topped up, because you always had enough fuel to make it to that alternate, normally Elmendorf in Alaska, if somebody ripped the hose off the tanker.
Right.
So that you always carried that amount of fuel on board the aircraft. And sometimes those missions would be 4 or 5 hours long, waiting for that bomber to come through. And then we'd go and intercept the bomber, dark up there in those times of the year for 24 hours a day. And so that we had a 16 million candlepower light on the side of the fuselage. We'd throw that light on them just to show them, you boys want to come for real? We'll get you before you can launch your cruise missiles. And they always reacted by turning around. They didn't continue on. But our rules of engagement were that we couldn't touch them unless they dropped troops or weapons. Now, if we went on their side of the border, they would shoot at us. Their rules of engagement were different than ours. We didn't take fighters north of 80 north under an agreement with the Russians that they wouldn't bring fighters north of 80 north, because we start mixing up fighters, something's going to happen that you don't want. So that's how those missions were conducted. You'd recover back into Inuvik and go back onto alert. And sometimes you'd get 2 scrambles in a day, but generally not. Every 2 or 3 days, you'd be into Inuvik for about a 10 to 15-day period. And those temperatures outside were about 50 below, in those days, so that it was a big demand on our ground crew. And, I have ground crew working with me now that flew with me out of Inuvik, and maintained our airplanes. They always say those were the best 3 or 4 years on 441 Squadron of their whole careers. The guys loved it, and they did such a remarkable job. And you bet your life on what they did, because you eject up in the high Arctic, it's 24 hours before search and rescue can get up to help you. And that's only a 19-foot chute on the ejection seat of an F-18. You come down hard. So everybody that's ejected out of the F-18 has been hurt.
Yeah.
So we know we're going to be on the ice and we're going to be hurt.
Wow. So some really, really high stakes flying.
Yeah, but it was fun. It was a challenge, but you got a lot out of it.
Yeah. Now, this November, we remember that Canadians have a long history of serving in conflicts and will likely continue to do so. What advice do you have for Canadians who are currently serving or will serve in future global conflicts?
I think when you're going into combat, you want to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And you don't want to be afraid. And the way you stop being afraid is to get confident in what you're doing. All my time on fighter aircraft, I never had any fear of going to war. I knew I was better than anybody I was going to run up against. I had advantage. Now, if you get into a gunfight with another airplane, one of you is going to die. You cannot escape a gunfight without getting killed. If you run out of fuel going into that gunfight, you're going to get killed. So it was a dangerous environment, but if you felt good about what you do and you practice a lot and you didn't fly afraid, you'd do well. You'd be okay.
Wow.
KF Aerospace, Canada's largest MRO and founding partner in SkyAlign for the Future Aircrew Training Program, is proud to be the exclusive North American dealer for the Grobe 120TP. The Grobe 120TP is a world-class training aircraft, combining turbine power, advanced avionics, side-by-side seating, and full aerobatic capability. Already trusted by the German Air Force, Canada's Future Aircrew Training Program, and militaries worldwide, it's built to deliver performance and reliability. With its versatility, the Grobe 120TP is the ideal platform for both military training and civilian programs, including upset recovery training. Go to kfaero.ca, that's kfaero.ca, to learn more and get in touch with us.
So I'd like to shift topics here and talk about a really interesting story. Famously, Soviet MiG-29s visited Abbotsford for the airshow in 1989. Can you walk us through the day the MiG-29s transited Canadian airspace?
Yeah. Before that started, Brian, the Soviets, towards the end of the Cold War, 1989, were going broke. And they recognized that as a problem. And the West knew that they were having financial difficulties. But what they decided to do was start marketing their MiG-29 to the rest of the world. That was their latest fighter technology, And towards accomplishing that mission, they decided that they would do the air show in, I think it was June of 1989 at Paris in France. And Anatoly Kabocha was their demo pilot. And he ended up ejecting at really low altitude from his airplane after an engine failure. And so that, of course, wasn't a very good demo of MiG-29's capability. And Anatoly, you can still see that video of his ejection on YouTube. And it's a remarkable demonstration of that seat capability. His chute had hardly opened when he hit the ground. And Beller, he just throws his chute off. He stands up. The fireball's only 100 feet away from him. He reaches into a pocket, grabs a cigarette, and lights it, watches airplane burn. He's a fighter pilot. I love that. And the Soviets then decided, okay, the next show is going to be in North America. And Abbotsford is one of the bigger shows in North America, especially for military equipment. And so they decided that to demo the airplane in Abbotsford. And what they wanted was they wanted one of their pilots to either fly the F-15 or the F-18, and in return, they would allow a Western pilot to fly their MiG-29. And the Americans said, no way. You're not getting near our airplanes. They had nothing to win, they figured. And so they were adamant. Nobody's getting near an F-18 or an F-15. And the Soviets deployed to through Alaska to come down to Abbotsford. And the Soviets were really upset that they couldn't get that reciprocal agreement, but they were going to participate anyhow. And so that they spent the night in Elmendorf, and then they were going to deploy the next morning down to Abbotsford. Now, I was the Alert Force commander in Comox at that time. I normally kept 4 jets out there, but this day I only had 3 jets serviceable. And so one of them was a duo. So I took all 4 pilots with me, and NORAD told me that I was not to go any closer than 1,000 feet to these MiG-29s and make no attempt to communicate with them. This was simply an escort mission, And so I said, yeah, we can live with that. And at the appropriate hour, they scrambled us. So I scrambled all 3 jets, and we went up and we intercepted these 2 MiG-29s on the bottom of the Alaska Panhandle. And there were still F-15s escorting them at that point. So we took that opportunity to get some pictures of all the airplanes flying south. And then the F-15s waved off and they went back into Elmendorf. And so that we continued along. I stayed about 1,000 feet behind them. We were 35,000 feet. And then they climbed up to 37. So we go up to 37,000 feet with them. And I noticed that they were sitting about 40 degrees right of what I thought they should be going, And we're all undercast. You can't see the ground below you. So they had no idea whether they're going out to sea or not, I guess. And I became curious about that. So I called up NORAD and said, hey, where are these boys headed? They seem to be about 40 degrees right of track. NORAD comes back to me and says that we have no idea. We have no idea where they're heading. So then on my second radio, I go over to Vancouver Center, and I asked them, I said, you got 2 MiG-29s heading south. We're escorting, and I'd like to know where they're heading. And Vancouver Center comes back to me and says, hey, we can see this whole package of airplanes heading south, but we haven't talked to anybody. So then I became a little concerned, and I said, well, I got these rules, but I'm going to break them. And so I drove up beside the lead MiG-29. And he's pointing at his headset and giving me a thumbs down, telling me he's got a radio failure. And then, so I pointed at him, and I pointed about 40 degrees to the left. And he turned immediately. Both airplanes turned immediately over to that direction. Then I asked him how much fuel he's got on board by hand signals, just a drinking motion with your thumb. And he comes back with 3 fingers. And so that means he's got 30 minutes of fuel left. Well, if we go direct to Abbotsford, it's going to take us about 30 minutes. So I became really concerned now. And so that I patted my shoulder, which means joined up close formation on my wing. So I put 2 MiG-29s on my right wing and I got clearance from Abbotsford to take this package direct to Abbotsford. And the Vancouver Center was more than happy to see this happen. I never talked to NORAD again, even though I was assigned to them. And we start this. NORAD never said a word to me. And then at the appropriate point, I started an en route descent. I brought my 2 F-18s on my left wing, had 2 MiG-29s on my right. We go through 30,000 feet of cloud. I had no idea whether these guys could fly formation or not. Test pilots, and they did a remarkable job. They were tucked right in with overlap on that right wing. So there's no reason to be concerned. We broke out of cloud about 1,500 feet above ground, maybe 10 miles short of the runway. And so I did a low approach into Abbotsford, turned it downwind. I waved off the 2 MiG-29s to land. And we came by once they were on the runway, did a fly past over top of them, and then went back to Comox. Now, I wanted to land in Abbotsford, and talk to these boys, but of course I'm armed. I can't land in Abbotsford, and so we head back to Comox. And after I landed in Comox, the crew chief comes up the ladder before I got out of the cockpit, and he says, "Hey, mate," he says, "that phone's been ringing off the wall for you." And I figured, no kidding. I just broke every rule that NORAD had given me. So this Commander NORAD wanted to talk to me. And after I got into the office, the phone rings again. I answered, and it wasn't NORAD calling me. It was the ambassador from the Soviet Union that was calling me and just wanted to thank me for helping the boys get into Abbotsford. And I said, "Well, you're very welcome. It's our pleasure." And he says, "Well, I'd like you to be our guest of honor at the Abbotsford Airshow." And I said, "Okay, yeah, I'm taking 2 airplanes over there anyhow for static display. I'd love to be. I'd love to meet you guys." And so we did. We deployed on the Friday, we deployed over to the show in Abbotsford. I went over to the Soviet pavilion and introduced myself to the guard that was outside. He goes inside and he comes out and he says, "Niet, go away." So I kind of laughed, what's going on? I'm supposed to be their guest of honor. And so on the Saturday, I go back and see him again. And the guard goes in, comes back out, and he says, "Yeah, go away." And what was happening was that they were really working hard and trying to get this exchange of cockpits between their pilots and our pilots on our airplanes. And they couldn't get it. So they were so upset. So on the Sunday, towards the end of the show in the afternoon, they changed their mind. They said, "Okay, we'll allow a Western pilot to fly the MiG-29 without a reciprocal agreement." What they're really after is they want somebody to go public as to how great this airplane was. And it was. It was pretty impressive to watch it do its air shows. And General Scott Eichel, he was 2-star. He was a senior general at the show. He comes over to me and he said, "Bobby," he said, "would you fly that MiG-29? And I said, "Yeah, I'll do that." And so they took me over to that. Mary Collins was a deputy defense minister at the time. She was at the show as well. This thing was getting lots of attention, both politically and militarily. And I'm sitting there putting on Roman's. He's a demo pilot because Anatoly was still hurting. He was a demo pilot at Abbotsford, and he was maybe 5'10", quite a stocky built guy, but he gives me his G suit because my G suit won't adapt to their aircraft. And so it kind of fit, I could tell it wasn't going to work very well, but, I put it on. And then he gives me his helmet, because my helmet doesn't adapt to his airplane. And so, Jesus, it was about 2 sizes too big. I could take this helmet, turn it around on my head, And I didn't care. I was getting to fly this MiG-29. And while I was doing this, it was funny. Mary Collins comes up to me. She says, "Major Wade," she says, "don't screw this up or we're both looking for work." And I just kind of laughed, She walked away. That's all she said. She was scared. because she'd been told by the Minister of National Defense that this wouldn't happen. And the same with Scott. He was told by the Chief of Defense Staff that this wouldn't happen. So these guys stuck their necks way out, to allow this to happen. It wasn't really what they were told as a reciprocal exchange, but we weren't supposed to be getting in their airplanes, so they were scared. And they took me, and I climbed up into the front seat of that dual MiG-29. Valerie Minitsky got in the back seat, and Valerie didn't speak a word of English. And so the translator taught him how to say Bob pilot and Valerie pilot. And I start strapping in there, and there's a ground crew there helping me strap into the jet. He shows me how to start it up. And, it's typical fighter cockpit, but all the instruments are in Cyrillic. I couldn't read any of them, I didn't know where the G meter was, airspeed indicators. I had no idea what the flap speeds were, the gear speeds, none of that. So I just assumed that, Valerie was going to fly it from the back seat. The back seat's got such poor visibility. He's got to fly it through a periscope, that they had in the back seat. So he's got very limited ability, but I'm sure they're competent at doing that. And we get it fired up and start taxiing out. Stick's about 3 or 4 inches higher than what they are in the F-18, so it felt a little bit awkward, but, it was comfortable enough. And just as soon as we started taxiing out, Valerie says, Bob pilot. Jesus, okay. I had to use differential braking. I didn't know where there was nose wheel steering on this thing or not, So I taxi out. I got clearance to take off, and Valerie wants me to take off. No idea what the takeoff speed was. Now, on the F-18 show, I did a takeoff loop, and I'm sure the MiG-29 could have done it, but I wasn't going to try that. So I did a roll off the top. The difference between the F-18 and the MiG-29 was when I went through the vertical after takeoff with the F-18, the airspeed would stagnate or maybe roll back a few knots. I was watching the airspeed indicator in this thing, and they're in kilometers per hour, so it didn't mean much, but it stayed the same or maybe even kept increasing a wee bit. So I knew the thrust to weight was better than what I had in the F-18. What I didn't know was how much fuel he had on board. Maybe he was only going with a quarter tank, so that's why the thrust to weight was so good. So I did a roll off the top, and I did another roll off the top after that to gain some altitude, and then went into some hard maneuvering. I did what I thought was about a 7G, 360-degree turn. And Jesus, that airspeed remained stable throughout that whole turn. So I was really impressed, with the thrust to weight and turn capability of that airplane. And I would guess it was about the same as an F-18. I getting around the 360 in about 12 seconds. And then Valerie in the back seat, he says, Valerie pilot. So he has control. And then he gets into a corner that I'm guessing was 2G above what I was pulling. He was about 9G. And I had no idea that he was going to go and do that, of course. So I'm buried in the cockpit at 9G. And I didn't gray out, but, I couldn't move. I was pinned down in the seat, And Valerie rolls out of that. And then he takes the airplane. We're about 3,000 feet above the ground. And he pulls into the vertical, pulls both throttles to idle. The airplane stops going up and starts into a tail slide. Now, if you did that in an F-18, you got to bail out because you can't recover. It takes about 5,000 feet to get your nose down if you go into a tail slide with an F-18. Valerie lit both burners. Both burners lit off at exactly the same time, which the F-18 didn't. One had lit off before the other. And so that was different technology as well. But Valerie just pushed the stick forward and the nose dropped. And I kind of had a problem with that because if you're going backwards and you push the stick forward, your nose should throw you on your back. Your elevator's working the opposite direction. But it didn't. The nose came down perfectly, flew right out of it, and he only lost about 200 feet, after he put the power in the burner. And so I started saying Bob pilot a lot then, and I needed to try that. And so I did. He said Bob pilot, and so I went into it. And the first one, I just duplicated what he did. I didn't learn anything from that. So I did another one. And this time on the recovery, when I lit the burners, I didn't let the nose drop. I went to about 70 degrees nose up and just left it in burner. And that thing just stopped going down. It just battled its way out of it into a climb again. I was so impressed with the high angle of attack capability of that airplane. I would say it was better than an F-18, but it's hard to make those comparisons. I couldn't do the exact maneuvers I did with the air show and the F-18, but I was pretty impressed. Then he says Bob landing. I guess we're out of gas. I don't know. And so I go back, pitch it out, land it, and it landed real nice and smooth. Valerie pulled the drag chute from the back seat, but because I didn't know it had a drag chute. But anyhow, slowed her down, and he taxied it in, and we shut her down. Well, Jesus, once we shut down, there was a crowd of people there you couldn't believe, and lots of military boys from us and the media. But the Soviets, they didn't allow me to talk to anybody. Okay, they said, come with us. And they took me over to their pavilion. And I go into their pavilion, and they pour these tumbler glasses half full of vodka. And they toast the Mikoyan company. So, yeah. Those boys, when they drink a shot, they drink it all in one shot. And so that, I was a fighter pilot. I can do that. And I'm not a drinker, so I fired this glass back and figured, okay, that's okay. Then they fill these tumblers up again. Now, I'm guessing there's 3 ounces, 4 ounces of liquor in each glass.
Wow.
This time they toasted the Soviet Union. Well, I guess they got to toast that as well. So I fired that thing back the same as they did. And my tongue starts tingling, and, I'm starting to feel the effects of all this alcohol right away. And then they toasted me. Well, so, okay. Again, tumblers half full. I fired that back. Well, God, that was the next thing to passing out at that point. I stayed for maybe another 10, 15 minutes. I don't know. I can't remember. I was too drunk. And I come out of their pavilion. I go outside, and the media is there in their droves. They want to talk to me. Well, I'm shit-faced, And so these these interviews are on YouTube. They used to be anyhow. I haven't seen them for years. But it's kind of funny, But I painted them 10 feet tall. I said, I'm really impressed with this jet. They did a great job. And the Soviets really appreciated that. So that I got out in 91, I went airlines, and it was about 96, I guess. They called me from Langley Air Force Base, which CIA boys. And they said, Bobby, the Soviets want you to fly their Su-30. And I said, God, I'm an airline pilot. I'm not a fighter pilot anymore. Yeah, we know who you are. And the Soviets want you to fly it, and they'll pay you $15,000 to do it. And it's in Farnborough, at the Farnborough Airshow. I said, yeah, I'd do that. So I called my boss, and he said, yeah, go do that. And I was supposed to leave on about 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. I get a call about 3 o'clock in the morning from these same boys in Langley. He says, Bobby, it's all off. The Soviets aren't coming with their Su-30. And, nobody saw that Su-30 for about another 5 years. So I don't know what happened. It never happened. But I'm really disappointed. I never got a chance to fly that thing.
Yeah, that would have been amazing.
Oh, yeah, it's vector thrust. Yeah. So, yeah, I wanted to fly it, but oh, well.
So what was the international reaction to that flight? Like, was it a big deal? Did you hear from a lot of people, or?
It got media attention around the world. I got letters from Hong Kong and all over Europe and all this stuff. Guys I knew, I'm flowing with, right to me, said, yeah, it's in the newspapers here. Yeah, how did that happen and all this stuff? So, yeah, it got international attention. And I got a call from Ottawa, said the Chief of Defense Staff wants to talk to me. And so I flew down to Ottawa, and next morning I go to their, I don't know whether they do this every day or weekly or whatever, but all the Army, Navy commanders and Air Force commanders are at this conference. And so I go over to the NDHQ to attend this thing in the morning, and the colonel is there. He's kind of coordinating all this stuff, and he's telling me, he says, okay, no more than 5 minutes. You only answer questions, and, give me all kinds of rules I have to obey. So I went in there, and Paul Manson's the Chief of Defense Staff. And so he was my boss when I was in Lahr in Germany. And I knew Paul well. And so I walk in there and he says, well, he says, good to see you. He says, how are the kids? How's David? What grades he in now and all this stuff. Like, and the rest of these guys are all standing up. How the hell does he know this? And he said, I heard you had quite a weekend. And I said, yeah. And it was a lot of fun and I learned a lot. And he says, great. And he asked me the story. I told him the story. And I was in there about 40 minutes. And so it got a lot of attention. And then when I got out of there, the CIA boys were in there and they wanted to talk to me. So I talked to them for an hour maybe. And I went back to Cold Lake, 441, and they come back out of fighter group and said, okay, you're going on tours. So I traveled around NATO for the next year as a 20-minute expert on a MiG-29, So it got a lot of attention. Yeah. All of a sudden, Canada had a secret that the rest of the world didn't have. And in those circles, what they do is they trade information. Okay. And so that we had a secret that other people wanted to know. And so, okay, you tell us this and we'll let you know about that, that type of stuff.
Wow. That's that's a very unique circumstance to have happen.
Yeah, really. Yeah. It was just time and place. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked a little about this earlier, but eventually you decided to transition to civilian aviation. What made you decide it was time to leave the military in 1990?
Yeah, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was really 91 before that flag came off the Kremlin, that our Air Force decided that we're going to downsize. And so we went from 6 fighter squadrons down to 3. And I could see that, hey, the writing's on the wall. There's not going to be much flying time anymore. And I'm not doing ground jobs. So a bunch of us boys got out and we went airlines. And I went with a company called Canada 3000. And the previous CO from 441 Squadron had already gone down there to Canada 3000. So he gave them my name and they called me up and asked me if I'd do it. So I said, yeah. And so my wife had already moved to Comox because I was spending most of my time in Comox on Cold Lake. So that I promised her that once I got out of the Air Force, I'll be home all the time because I was always away. And first thing I do, of course, is join an airline. And so I'm down in Toronto and learn how to fly this 757. They make you a first officer. The company only had 27 pilots or 28 pilots at that time. It was a brand new startup. And so I'm down in Toronto. I take this course flying 757. And civilian training to fly an airplane is not anything like military training. And so, God, it was a real gentleman's course. I was out of there in a couple of days and into the airplane. And you're a first officer, when you're doing what you're told. And then after about 6 months, the company buys these Airbus 330s. And I was selected to be captain on these Airbus 330s. And so I flew them with Canada 3000 until 97, 98, 97, I guess it was. And it was a great airplane, great job. Not really challenging much. When you're a captain in the civilian industry, they're paying you for what you know. You do very little flying. Everything's done on autopilot, and especially that 330. I mean, God, it was all flown by a computer. Yeah.
Well, Airbus are kind of renowned for that, right? Like being extremely computerized, even when how they handle emergencies and things.
Exactly. Yeah. And it has created a problem because nowadays guys don't know how to fly airplanes. Everything's done on the computer. Everything's done on autopilot, and so they don't get any opportunity to hand fly the airplane. And I used to make my first officers disconnect the autopilot on approach going through 20,000 feet and hand fly it, because that's the only opportunity they're going to get to do that. And I guess it helped, but they don't do that anymore.
Did you find that anything from fighter flying carried over to the airline cockpit?
Well, fighters going A to B was a very small part of your job. You fought that airplane. That was your job. Whereas in the airline, that's your total job, going A to B. And they put a lot of effort going from A to B. There are a lot of rules and regulations in the airline industry, but you've got 350 passengers back there. It's important that you do that safely and comfortably. So that was your primary job as a captain of an airplane, is keep it safe, keep it comfortable for the passengers. And there's always challenges. The companies are in this business to make money, so they don't give you a whole lot of extra fuel, and stuff like that. So you got to decide as captain, hey, I need more, or, I can live with what you're giving me, that type of thing. And weather, with the 330, initially we were limited to Cat 1, so 200 feet, half mile on approach. And so that once you started that approach, you're pretty much committed to landing. But later on, as the technology improved, I went over to Korean Air and flew A330s for them. And you'd run into zero visibility days, but that airplane that they had was Cat 3 Charlie. So there was no visibility limits. I could land 0-0.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I did that 3 or 4 times, I guess, in my career. And the big problem when you land off a 0-0 approach is finding a place to turn off that runway. You can't see anything. So that was a bit of a challenge. You can't taxi in because you don't know where you're going. So they'd normally send out a vehicle with flashing lights on it, and you could follow the vehicle back into the ramp.
Wow. I can't imagine flying a 0-0 approach. That just sounds that sounds scary, to be honest.
But, you monitored throughout that approach. You monitored all the instrumentation. You made sure that your 2 ILSs were hooked up at the same time and they're both reading the same. So, and the airplane calls out your altitudes, that type of stuff. So it, not that complicated a thing to do, but you were always there ready to take control if any of those systems started lying to you.
Yeah, of course. I'd like to take a moment and do some reflecting on your career. Looking back, what's the proudest moment of your flying career?
I think my biggest contribution to the military was as an instructor. That's so important in the military, that you have experienced guys that can teach the younger fellas, that job and keep it safe. And that's part of my PTSD, I guess, is that when we lost people, was that because of something I didn't teach them? And I know that. I know when Opie was killed up in a Nuvik, I felt bad because he just got into an unusual attitude and pushed it in the ground, And if he had been taught better how to do unusual attitude recoveries, he would have lived, And so I felt bad that I didn't do that for him. And, once you get operational training, there's so many other things that they have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you forget about the basics. And so I think that was my biggest single contribution, was as an instructor.
Now, I think you said this in part 1, but which aircraft would you most love to fly again and why?
Yeah, Starfighter, And I think all the boys that flew the Starfighter would give you the same answer. And it was such an incredible airplane. It flew like a missile, and it has so much power. And we weren't limited by power. We were limited by heat. So that when you're in that air temperature, hit 121 degrees centigrade, I think it was, you got a slow light in the cockpit. And they told us not to mess with that. That would eat the engine up. But, God, you still had power to go way faster. So I think that was part of it. And all your flying was done right on the trees.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting in itself.
Yeah. What do you miss most about operational flying?
I miss the guys. Squadron life was incredible. And those boys were all so good. They cared about doing that job as much as I did. They wanted to be the best they could be. Their skill levels were incredible. And I was so proud to be with them. So, if I miss anything, I miss the boys. And luckily, I'm at the Cold War exhibit now where we have 70 vets in there. And it's kind of like a squadron environment. That helps me more than anything, I think.
Mm-hmm. Having brought the F-18 online as a new aircraft, politics aside, what challenges do you think the RCAF will face bringing the F-35 to the flight line?
There's going to be a lot. Infrastructure. is going to be the initial problem. They're about 3 years behind now developing the infrastructure to bring the F-35 to Canada. And how they're going to accomplish that, I don't know. The support that airplane will need is not in place. So maybe the guys are going to fly out of the States, I don't know. Or maybe they throw enough money at it that they can increase that capability. And then I don't think training is going to be a big issue because they're training in the States on the F-35. And so there's lots of experience down there on that airplane. Although I was watching the young lady doing the air show in Abbotsford, and she's the air show pilot on the F-35. She's got less than 1,000 hours total flying time and 350 hours on the jet.
Wow.
So, hey, there's obviously a shortage of personnel down there as well. Yeah. And I know a lot of our boys have less than 1,000 hours when they're doing shows as well. So I think experience levels is going to be a huge challenge. Who's there to do the instructing? And I know that's the big problem in Canada. All our training's gone offshore, because we don't have instructors. And that was a huge mistake by the military to allow that change in personnel where you lost the people with experience. They all went airlines,
Mm-hmm. So this episode will air on Remembrance Day. Given that, I'd love to spend a little time on the topic of Remembrance Day. What will you be doing this year to mark that special day?
Well, this year, I'm the honorary chair of the Air Force Association. And we have 5 wings in Alberta. And so I'm honorary chair of those 5 wings. And so that typically I go to one of the wings on November 11th to talk or present reefs and stuff like that. So this year I'm in Calgary. But I spent a lot of time before November 11th talking to students in schools. And the message you want to give is what life is like in the Air Force and why it's important, because those kids have never learned that lesson. Now, the kids in Europe are different. We never brought the bodies back to Canada until after 1971. So there's lots of cemeteries in Europe, and those cemeteries are maintained by school children. And so those kids understand the price that was paid to maintain this way of life we have. And the Canadian kids don't have that luxury. Now, we are fortunate in the sense we're getting a lot of people out of Ukraine coming into Alberta right now. And those people do understand what it's like to be in war. And so I encourage those kids to talk to the rest of the kids, to tell them what it's like, to live in those conditions. And I think that's effective. But the more we can get the young people to understand the importance of the military and the sacrifices that have been made up to this point, the better it will be for Canada. Canadians will start to vote in elections for parties that support the military.
Many people associate Remembrance Day with the World Wars. What would you want Canadians to remember about those who served during the Cold War?
I want them to know about the sacrifices we made to win that war and the challenges that we faced and the threat that occurred, so that they understand that that wasn't won by accident. That was won through a tremendous commitment. And so I'm hoping, the World War II, World War I, they were very important, really significant. And Canadian contribution was recognized around the world. But the Cold War was a threat bigger than both those other wars. That could have changed the world forever. And the media never covered it. So Canadians never felt a threat. Canadians didn't think, well, there's just more going on in international politics. It wasn't. It was a real threat.
When you think back to your time in uniform, who or what do you find yourself remembering most?
I remember the good times. I remember the flying. That was so incredible. I love the flying. But I remember, just different adventures with different guys, us deploying down to Rome or, someplace on a squadron exchange and stuff like that, and all the fun you'd have. Is that we partied just as hard as we flew. It was a time in the evolution of the military where we weren't probably politically correct, drank too much, and partied long hours. You went to beer call on Friday night. You were there until 3 o'clock in the morning. And they did that every week. You didn't want to go home. You were just having too much fun. So I miss that. I miss the boys.
Yeah, I can understand that feeling. Having just gotten out of the military, we talked earlier about what's the thing you miss most about operational flying, and for that and for this, your answer is I miss the boys, and yeah, I miss the folks I flew with. That's the thing I miss the most is sitting around. I miss the flying, but I really miss sitting around and connecting and talking about the flight and just kind of shooting the crap in the ready room and connecting. I really miss that.
Yeah, and it's not common in industry for that to happen. I think the defense industry is unique in that way, where you have that comradeship with the people you work with.
I think so. I think if anyone else manages to get something close to that, they're very fortunate because it's a very unique thing.
It really is. Yeah.
How can everyday Canadians best show remembrance or gratitude for military service beyond the poppy and the ceremony?
I think supporting the military is such a huge issue in Canada. Canadians don't feel the threat. We live next door to Uncle Sam. Why should we have a big military? They really don't understand why it's necessary. And the political parties don't put much money into the military. It's been decreasing in size, ever since the end of World War II, because they're going after votes. If the Canadian public doesn't feel that we need the military, the government certainly won't support it.
Mm-hmm.
They're going after votes. And so somehow we have to educate the Canadian public so they know how important it is to maintain this defensive posture that we have.
Yeah, I agree. I think probably that being said, some of the best things they can do is visit museums like the one that you volunteer at, bring the kids, help educate the youth, I'll say, on kind of our past and our present and the threats that we face.
Yeah. We're kind of like in another Cold War right now. There's a lot going on in the world.
There really is. Yeah. Well, Bob, that wraps up our 2-part Remembrance Day interview. I'm truly grateful that you took the time to share your stories with us. And again, I want to thank you for your service and for being here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, that does it for our 2-part series on Remembrance Day with Major Retired Bob Wade, former Cold War fighter pilot and the first Western pilot to fly in a MiG-29. Tune in next week as we do something very special and have our first American guest on the show, author and retired aerial gunner Anthony Dyer. He wrote the book Moonchild and was an aerial gunner on the famous AC-130H Spectre gunship, as well as the HH-60G Pavehawk rescue helicopter. So tune in for that one. It's going to be very exciting and you do not want to miss it. Do you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard in this show? Would you or someone you know make a great guest, or do you have a great idea for a show? You can reach out to us at thepilotprojectpodcast@gmail.com or on all social media at @podpilotproject. And be sure to check out that social media for lots of great videos of our RCAF and mission aviation aircraft. As always, we'd like to thank you for tuning in and ask for your help with the big 3. That's like and follow us on social media, share with your friends, and follow and rate us 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Keep the blue side up. See ya!
Engineer, shut down all